right. My question was actually for Mr. Korowicz, but any of you, I suppose, could talk to it. You said that you didn't think that it would be productive for people to get caught up in blaming bankers. Given the tremendous inequality, at least in the U.S., that has come to exist, do you believe that positive political change is completely impossible in terms of ameliorating the effects of all of these issues? Or is there some other reason why you don't think sort of political change is a sort of feasible going forward?
Yeah, political change. I think we're going into crisis mode now. I don't think we have time to persuade the citizenry in the world that we need a new political leadership. And even if we did, I don't really know what they do. I mean, we're still going. I think there are forces far bigger than our own presumptions driving these things. And I think on the blame issue, I mean, I think there's, if you say rather than blaming people, you say there are principles. Now, one of the things, say in Ireland, I'd like them to do is effectively half sterilise land purchases. So basically we don't have people coming in buying up everything. That sort of thing. But I think a lot of wealthy people, or people who think they're wealthy, are going to lose an awful lot. They're going to lose everything. They're wealthy and it's on paper. It doesn't really, it's going to go along with everything else. And they may not be wealthy anymore. And I also think that as a society, the big issue is how collectively we deal with this challenge for us. And at another time, in another place where things were fine and it was just, at times, outright stupidity, at other times criminality, it would be, let's go and screw them to the wall, and make sure that they sort of spend their lives living in a shoebox. But because of the challenges, it's not that you don't say, let's get some of these people and whatever, but if it's turned into your rallying cry, where else does everything else fit into it? Because the thing about rallying cries is that they're pretty monopolistic of space. Do you know what I mean? It becomes, in the media, it's, the bankers took us down. And what we really need is another narrative that's louder and has more space, which was, collectively, we are running into the wall. And you know what? In Ireland and things, you've done well. It wasn't just the bankers who screwed you over. Likewise in Ireland. There was a march some months ago of civil servants, and it struck me as they were walking by. Here are people in the top 10% of the world's wealthiest people complaining about the iniquities and the terrible wrong that's been done to them by the 0.1% of the world's wealthiest people. Mm-hmm. So it's good to remember that, count where your blessings have been. That's all I'd say.
I suppose it's good for the top 0.1% if we think of it that way.
One thing I would say about the prospects for government action, governments are crowds. They are reactive, not proactive. And essentially, it means that whatever they do, they're doing extrapolating past trends forward and not anticipating trend changes. So that's like driving your car, flooring it, while looking only in the rearview mirror. It's practically a guarantee of a really nasty accident. Plus, the people who are in power tend to have the most invested in the status quo. They tend to have benefited greatly from that. These are not the people you're going to look to change that kind of system. I more or less ignore them. And I pay attention to municipal politics and things at lower levels, but I don't expect anything good to come from the top down. I suppose they might surprise me, but I really genuinely would be surprised.
Thank you for staying up here from Ireland. My question kind of referred to the narrative as well. I mean, I was hoping 9/11 we would get beyond the narrative of blame, and I was hoping during Katrina we would get beyond the narrative of blame, and now we have the Gulf spill, and again, it's the narrative of blame. If I'm telling this story, the narrative that we all participated in us getting here, what would be some of the places where you say that this story started? You know, you referred earlier about England and credit, you know, to fuel their wars. Where would I tell an individual we got off on this track? You know, I mean, I guess some of it's obvious. I'm sitting here and the light bulbs are going off. Like, how does a living system not know exactly where its foods come from and where its water comes from, you know, and where its poop goes, like you said? So, you know, I really think it's important that we move above this narrative of blame. But when we're talking to individuals and saying, you know, we all participated in this, where would be some of the points where I'd say, you know, we got on this track together?
We've had a credit expansion for a long time. It's been decades that we collectively got on this route to reliance on human promises, to the broadening of wealth. I mean, broadening of the money supply drastically away from anything that could be considered underlying real wealth. And it really is that we did this together. Yes, there's an extremely predatory system, but at the same time, everyone else was perfectly prepared to buy into something that they should have known was too good to be true. So when you look in Europe, where the Germans say to the Greeks, you were greedy, and the Greeks say to the Germans, you were predatory, well, they're both right. And it wouldn't have worked without both halves of that. So people were too ready to buy into an impossible dream, and there were predatory people out there only too happy to offer it to them. And it kept a system going, expanding to a point that has taken all of us to where we are now facing some really, really unpalatable choices. No regulation that is brought in now is going to make any difference. It's locking the barn door after the horse is bolted. We needed to prevent this at least 30 years ago if we were actually going to prevent it. Probably at least 30 years ago. We've been eating our seed corn since then. We've been hollowing out our system. So I think we need to look at really the era of globalization, at the point where we decided that the limits that we were facing within our own countries were too restrictive, so we decided to develop a system that allowed us to pick the pockets of the entire rest of the world, which is exactly what globalization was about. All human political structures concentrate wealth at the center at the expense of the periphery. So when the scope for doing that was too narrow within a national context, we globalized it and then monetized everything so that we could suck surpluses in from the whole rest of the world instead of our own more local periphery. And so I think we've been on this path for a very, very long time, certainly since the financial liberalization of the 80s under Reagan and Thatcher. And that brought us a lot of prosperity, material prosperity, brought us, that is, at the expense of the rest of the world, which we were actively undeveloping for that entire period of time by sucking it dry of resources, getting it into debt, slavery, dumping all the externalities in places in the third world. So, I mean, we say, oh, well, we've increased our energy efficiency. Well, all we did is we offshored our demand so that the energy that we benefit from is now nominally consumed somewhere else. We can blame somebody else for it. But we are the ones who have benefited enormously from the system as it exists. And for people who say we should blame bankers, we need to remember that the rest of the world looks at all of us like we might look at bankers. So we should not be too keen to play the blame game, because we are going to be on the receiving end of blame from the vast percentage of the rest of the population of the world, merely by virtue of living in developed countries at the standard of living that we do. Our standard of living would not be possible if we had not been able to cream off surpluses from layers and layers and layers below us and in other areas. So we are absolutely beneficiaries of that. We are as culpable at that level as we perceive bankers to be. And playing a blame game gets nobody anywhere. We need to stay in a constructive headspace and say, never mind that. That was then, this is now. What are we going to do? And what resources we have, whether it's time or energy or money, we need to devote those to looking after our friends and our families and our community, not witch hunting bankers. Whoever we may feel is culpable, witch hunts are simply a waste of resources. They simply throw away energy that will be in short supply, which we could have done something vastly better with.
Thank you.
All right, my question would be directed at probably all three of you, and it'd be interesting to see how you each respond for the time frame that I'm going to pose here. Clearly, today's discussion shows that, or alludes to the fact that business as usual is not going to continue, and at some point we're going to see a large reversal of our good fortune. With that in mind, where do you see things going backward to? Like, how far back of a step are we going to be taking, and what time frame do you see that happening in?
I think this narrative of going back is not a very useful one. You know, time goes forward, life goes forward, and going back also has the sense of that we're on a natural path of should be going onward and upward. I don't really know. I think we are. I think we're going to a place we've never been before, but it's a place that many people have lived through before. So by that I mean that I think we're going to have a fast collapse because the systems we depend upon are much faster and more complex and integrated and all of that. I think, you know, within the next 10 years, 15 years, we're going to see these things, many of these things play out. That wherever we're going to, I think one of the benefits is that I think the hardest bit is going to be when everything falls apart. Unlike the collapse of Rome or whatever, you know, we may be in a position where we've done most of the heavy lifting and probably a lot of the mortality business, you know, sooner rather than later. But I'm not really answering your question, but.
Yeah, I would agree with David that I don't think it's a question of being able to go back for the reasons that he was talking about in his presentation, that you can't simply take away certain things and then you'll be back X number of years to a previous situation. We have so many structural dependencies that if we take away certain critical systems, we can't just say, well, we'll take a step back to 1850 or whatever it might be, because we don't have what we had then. We have other things which are, if anything, going to make life harder, other dependencies, but we don't have the skills, we don't have the experience that they had back then. So I think it's too simple to simply say, take a step back to any particular given year. What I would say is that the time frame I'm expecting is for quite a rapid deleveraging and a rapid change. The way you see financial bubbles burst is there's a massive deleveraging in the early phase and then a depression that continues longer than that because the real economy will lag behind what's happening in the financial markets. Same drivers for both, but they drive finance faster. So what I would expect is something like happened in the Depression. In the Depression, financial markets bottomed in 1933. The Depression continued to 1939. This time, I would expect the financial markets to bottom sometime in perhaps 5 years from now, something of that order, and for depression conditions to continue for some years after that. What I'm very much hoping is that we avoid what happened at the end of the last depression, which of course was World War II. So I'm absolutely hoping we don't go in that direction. It is most definitely a concern that we could see some kind of global conflict develop as a result. Another point on time frame, if you look at the second largest bubble that we've seen in the history of the world, which was the South Sea bubble in the 1720s, when that burst, yes, there was an initial depression, but that wasn't the end of the story. Essentially, the aftermath of the South Sea bubble was decades of upheaval, culminating in a series of revolutions, including yours. So I think we're looking at something at least as significant as that, at least. And because this bubble is actually very much larger and involves a lot more in the way of resource limitations as well, and occurs against a backdrop of lower skills and higher expectations, I think it's entirely plausible to suggest that it would be significantly worse potentially than that. Whether it would be as large as the last collapse of empire that led to the Dark Ages, that's a little iffier, because instead of decades of upheaval, that's centuries of upheaval. I'm not convinced that we're necessarily in that kind of state, or that we would take such a giant step back, if you like. But I think at a minimum, we are looking at a century of on and off depressions, potentially periods of hyperinflation, great shortages, enormous dislocations, and absolutely political upheaval and conflict playing out over a period of decades. I mean, I don't think anyone in this room will see the end of it, for instance, and it's quite likely our children won't either. But hopefully our grandchildren will see something that will not be the kind of scenario that David and I have been talking about here. That I'm not thinking this is the end of history and we're all going back to the Stone Age or any such thing. But I do think it's going to be an enormous period of upheaval. I think the population at the end of this century is going to be drastically lower than it is now, because the carrying capacity of the world, well, even with fossil fuels, I think we have exceeded the carrying capacity of the globe. We are clearly hollowing out our structure. We are eating our seed corn with the population that we currently have. And when you actually reduce the supply of fossil fuels, the energy subsidy, then you reduce carrying capacity further. And the concern is that as you move into a period where there is not enough to go around, enough to sustain the population that you have, then people could actively degrade the remaining carrying capacity on the way down by cutting down everything that will burn and eating anything that is on four legs. So the worry is that we might actively reduce the carrying capacity to the point where by the end of the century the population could be very, very much lower than it is now. And I mean, to put that in perspective, if you look at what happened to global population, if you summed up the effects of World War I, the Spanish flu, and World War II, there was hardly a blip to the downside in terms of global population. So you would be talking about some very, very significant events if you were talking about a significantly lower population by the end of the century. But if you do end up with a lower population, all sorts of things are then possible. If you look at what happened in Europe after the disastrous 14th century, I mean, this was partly a culmination of a credit bubble, by the way, for people who are interested in the historical side of finance. There was a massive credit bubble that burst beginning in 1294, and that was one of the collapse of the world banking system as it was at that time, which was based in Italy. It was very much part of what gave us the disastrous 14th century, and it was, of course, complicated by the Little Ice Age and the Black Death and various other things. But at the end of that period, life looked an awful lot better for the people who were there. All of a sudden, they were not running up against resource limits anymore. The population had fallen a long way, and all of a sudden, life actually got an awful lot easier for the people at the bottom of the heap. There were labor shortages, so people had to be treated decently, as opposed to when there's a huge surplus of labor, then labor has no bargaining power at all, and the conditions of life for ordinary people deteriorate dramatically. But when there are not enough people to go around and people are really valuable, then things can start looking up again. So this is one of the reasons I'm not thinking in terms of we just go back to being hunter-gatherers or the Stone Age or anything like that. I think we take a step away from where we have gone. We have something that looks a bit like these speculative bubbles that goes like this and then like that. But what happens after you get to the bottom is you can resume some kind of more normal sort of pattern. The question is when, and my best guess is about a century.
I want to thank first all of you three for the excellent, sort of exhilarating talks we've heard today. And I have some friends who I refer to as pre-post-carbon, and they tend to challenge me on the narrative of collapse. So I am sort of plagued by the epistemological issues. So I'm wondering, I'd like to hear from all three of you, how would your most astute, well-informed critic address what you've said today, and most importantly, how would you respond to that critic?
Well, I mean, I haven't found an enormous number of people who have really tried to take apart my position in a really sort of rational way. There are people who would say, that I'm being too definitive, like I'm making things sound more certain than they feel they are. So Chris Martenson, for instance, would feel that there isn't enough information to draw the conclusions that I draw. And I respect his opinions, most definitely. Other criticisms tend to be couched in less useful ways. So, for instance, when Jeff Rubin at ASPO was asked his opinion of my presentation that I had just done, which was very similar to what I did here, he called it a bastardized version of monetarism that could only be devised by a non-economist. And so to that, my response initially would be, well, considering that the job economists have done in predicting this, could non-economists possibly do any worse? And I think it really helps to look from outside a discipline, because there are so many problems, especially in the case of economics, which is essentially a religion at this point. When the academic training in economics is so much indoctrination in things that are patently false, then I don't think it's any great deficit not to have gone through that process. So I don't feel I then had to unlearn 10 years worth of work in order to be useful. So that level of criticism, that very facile level of criticism that's just intended to make people laugh and dismiss without even thinking, I have seen that kind of criticism. There has not been very much that has been really reasoned, thoughtful critique. But there's been a fair amount of skepticism simply because people think, well, I just don't have the basis to judge. And so I either trust this person's judgment or I don't, and I don't know whether I have the basis to do that. But it has been I have not found myself surrounded by enormous amounts of critique on these tours that I do, on the whole.
About 15 months ago, I first gave a presentation. It was at the Ecological Society of America meeting, in which I first formally argued that societies can't reduce their consumption of resources voluntarily over the long term. And I was told later that there were a group of students in the back of the room who muttered to themselves, let's prove him wrong. And I hope they do.
I must say, in many ways, I've had a similar experience to Nicole, that where there is criticism, it tends to be, as I said, not very useful, in the that it's informed, it's a reaction that people are finding something uncomfortable. Funnily enough, the thing where I'd like somebody to critique me, because, it is a surmising or an intuition, a lot of it, is around, what I say about complexity of supply chains and infrastructure. Those complex, how vulnerable they are in terms of those sort of fixed costs and economies of scale and all of that. Because actually that research isn't there. There's no people who go around, because people haven't done lots of research on what happens if there is a major economic collapse, and gone and said, well, what are the cost curves for the grid to the electricity production, what is the base price that needs to be costed, etc., or what is the flow rate of inputs into the grid or complex infrastructure, what are they? All of these things are argued from a theoretical point of view, but I don't have, now, hopefully we're going to get some, but I don't actually have data where infrastructure makers, builders, owners have done their own analysis. So on that side, I think I'd be very happy for criticism. It would be very useful. But it hasn't come. So I'm waiting for that one. But otherwise, same as Nicole. I mean, often people, I think, you probably find that, I think in many ways, there's some people there intuit it. They kind of know quite well that there's something really wrong, not just wrong or bad, but that there's something profoundly wrong.
I mean, when you explain something like Ponzi dynamics, when I explain to people something like Ponzi dynamics, they say, oh, of course. It makes intuitive sense that people get told all the time, oh, don't worry your head about finance, it's far too complicated, so let us look after it. And this is not the case at all, but it's not that difficult to understand the basic models at the heart of this kind of system. But it wouldn't be in the interests of the powers that be for people to understand the system, because then they might understand that they're the prey. And so it is something that is not hard to explain to people. They do understand it. I can explain the financial system to high school students. It's really not that difficult to wrap one's head around. So I find that people do relate to what I'm trying to say, and they can see the points that I'm making and why the theoretical structures that I'm discussing have some kind of basis in reality. So I haven't had people mostly come up and, criticize it as being completely fanciful or any such thing.